The 5 bruises on my sister's pregnant belly were a death warrant. I just didn't realize I had been shaking the hand of the executioner every morning. The dinner at the Killian estate was supposed to be a celebration of silence, a rare night where the machinery of the empire slowed down enough for a family meal. Enzo Killian sat at the head of the mahogany table, his silhouette sharp against the amber glow of the wall sconces. Across from him, his sister Bianca sat with a stiffness that made the silk of her dress rustle like dry leaves. At his right hand sat Liam Valley, the man who had been his shadow for a decade, the man who handled the conversations in parked cars and the quiet wars of attrition that held their world together. Enzo raised a glass, the crystal catching the dim light. "To the future," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur. Bianca reached for her water glass, and for a fraction of a second, the careful architecture of her life collapsed. Her sleeve slid back, exposing 5 distinct points of pressure, dark, deliberate marks fading from purple to a sickly yellow at the edges. Enzo stopped mid-sentence. His chest went cold. He didn't look at his sister, he looked at Liam. The underboss was smiling. It was a calm, sinister expression, the look of a man who felt entirely untouchable because he was the one holding the keys. Liam noticed Enzo's gaze and didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his mouth widening into a mask of feigned concern that didn't reach his eyes. "Is something wrong, Enzo?" he asked, the smoothness of his tone acting as a direct insult. Bianca pulled her hand back, tucking her chin as she concentrated on staring at the floor. It was the walk and the posture of someone who had learned that being noticed was never safe. She moved carefully, managing a pain she didn't want anyone to notice, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles were white. Enzo sat perfectly still, the silence of the room pressing against him. He realized then that he had been blind. He had built an organization that demanded precision and vigilance at every hour, yet he had missed the rot sitting right beside him. Liam wasn't just his underboss. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing who had turned Bianca's life into a cruelty. The rage didn't come as a shout. It arrived as a quiet certainty, heavy and immovable like a stone in his chest. He dropped his napkin onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet house. The war hadn't started with a rival family. It had started here, at 2 o'clock in the morning, with a bruise and a betrayal. The crystal chandelier above the mahogany dining table hummed with a low, electric vibrance, casting sharp, fractured light across the Killian family crest engraved on the silver spoons. It was supposed to be a night of quiet triumph, a private dinner to celebrate the expansion of the Killian territory into the northern docks. Enzo Killian sat at the head of the table, his presence a heavy, silent anchor that commanded the room. To his right sat Liam Valley, his most trusted underboss, a man who had bled for the organization and handled the family's most sensitive protection details. "To family," Liam said, his voice smooth as the vintage Barolo he raised in a toast. He leaned back with a calm, sinister smile that had always signaled his unwavering confidence. Enzo nodded, his eyes momentarily softening as they landed on his sister Bianca, seated across from Liam. She looked radiant in a loose-fitting silk dress that barely concealed the curve of her 7-month pregnancy, yet there was a hollowness in her expression that Enzo's transactional mind had dismissed as mere exhaustion. The shift happened when Bianca reached for her water glass. As she stretched her arm forward, the heavy silk of her sleeve caught on the edge of the table and slid back toward her elbow. The overhead lights caught her skin, revealing 5 dark, rhythmic bruises wrapped around her forearm. They weren't the faint marks of an accidental bump. They were the deep, purple imprints of a man's fingers closing with calculated violence. Enzo stopped mid-sip, the wine turning to lead in his throat. He watched as Bianca's eyes darted toward Liam, her entire body flinching in a micro-movement as the underboss adjusted his seat. She pulled her arm back instantly, tucking the bruised limb beneath her belly as if she could shield her unborn child from the very air in the room. The silence that followed was different from the usual respect Enzo commanded. It was a cold, suffocating pressure. He looked at Liam, the man he had trusted with Bianca's safety, the man who was supposed to be her shield. Liam's eyes met Enzo's, and for a fraction of a second the mask of the loyal soldier slipped. Behind the sinister smile was a look of casual dominance, a silent admission that he believed himself untouchable within the empire Enzo had built. Enzo felt a patient, freezing rage lock into place beneath his ribs. He realized then that while he was busy governing the city, he had allowed a wolf to sit at his table. He didn't shout, he didn't reach for a weapon. He simply set his spoon down with a sharp metallic click that echoed like a gunshot against the fine china. The celebration was over. The hunt had begun. The heavy silence of the dining room was broken only by the rhythmic click of Liam's lighter as he ignited a celebratory cigar. Enzo sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the purple pressure marks staining Bianca's pale skin. The realization was a cold blade sliding between his ribs. For years he had operated on the belief that his house was a sanctuary, a fortress where his word was law and his sister was untouchable. Now the architectural flaw in his empire was sitting directly to his right. "Enzo, you're quiet tonight," Liam said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He leaned back, exhaling a plume of smoke that drifted toward the crystal chandelier. He looked every bit the loyal underboss, the man who had bled for the Killian name and stood by Enzo through every street war. "We're supposed to be celebrating the expansion. Why the face?" Bianca pulled her cardigan tighter, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the fabric to hide her arm. She wouldn't look at either of them. "I'm just tired, Liam," she whispered, her voice brittle. "The pregnancy, it takes a lot out of me." Liam leaned toward her, his expression shifting into one of profound, theatrical concern. He reached out as if to pat her hand, and Enzo watched the way Bianca's entire body recoiled, a micro-movement, a flinch so subtle only a hunter would catch it. Liam didn't miss it either. A flicker of something dark and triumphant danced in his eyes before he donned the mask of the protector again. "You should be resting, Bianca. This world is too loud for someone in your condition," Liam said softly. He then turned his gaze to Enzo, his brow furrowed in faux indignation. "I noticed the marks, Enzo, on her wrist when she reached for the water. Who did it? Give me a name and I'll handle it before the sun comes up. No one puts a hand on a Killian and lives to talk about it." Enzo felt a surge of visceral rage, the kind that made his vision narrow and his pulse thunder in his ears. He looked at Liam, really looked at him, and saw the wolf in sheep's clothing for the first time. The offer to handle it was a masterstroke of gaslighting, a way for the predator to offer his services to hunt himself. "I don't have a name yet, Liam," Enzo replied, his voice a low, dangerous hum. He picked up his wine glass, his grip so tight the stem threatened to snap. He watched Liam's calm, sinister smile, the one that suggested hidden guilt and a terrifying sense of dominance. "But I'm a patient man. I'll find out who crossed the line. And when I do, I won't just handle it. I'll make sure they feel every ounce of the terror they've inflicted." Liam nodded slowly, his smile never wavering. "That's the boss I know, loyal to the end." Enzo didn't blink. The transactional nature of their loyalty was dead. As he watched Liam finish his drink, Enzo began the mental work of dismantling the man he had once called a brother. The war had moved inside the walls, and for the first time, Enzo Killian wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for blood. The dinner continued, but the air in the room had changed for Enzo. Across the table, Liam was laughing, a sound that usually signaled brotherhood, but now grated against Enzo's nerves like jagged glass. Enzo didn't look at him. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Bianca, who was meticulously cutting her steak into tiny, symmetrical pieces, never once lifting her gaze from her plate. He felt a pull in his chest, a phantom ache that bypassed the hardened exterior of the Killian boss and struck at the boy who had grown up in a two-bedroom walk-up with nothing but a sister and a shared sense of survival. He remembered a winter in South Boston when the heat had been cut off for 3 weeks. He had been 12, already trying to run errands for the local crews to make an extra $20, coming home with bruised knuckles and a heart turning to stone. It was Bianca who had met him at the door every night. She hadn't asked about the money or the dangerous men he was starting to associate with. She had simply taken his frozen hands in hers and rubbed them until the feeling came back. She was the only person who saw the fear he worked so hard to mask with aggression. To the world, he was becoming a monster. To Bianca, he was just Enzo, the boy who used to make her grilled cheese sandwiches when their mother worked the double shift. The memory shifted to the day he took his first life. He had come home vibrating with a cold, electric terror, certain that the darkness had finally swallowed him whole. He had sat in the kitchen in total silence, waiting for the soul-deep rot to set in. Bianca hadn't said a word. She had simply sat across from him and pushed a glass of water toward his shaking hands, her eyes full of a devastating, unconditional loyalty that reached past the boss and touched the human being underneath. Now, looking at her in the dim light of the estate dining room, Enzo realized he had committed the ultimate sin of his own business. He had mistaken silence for safety. He had built this empire of marble and steel to protect her, but by delegating that protection to Liam, he had handed the keys of the kingdom to a wolf. He had been so focused on the business of blood that he had forgotten the blood that truly mattered. Liam made a joke, leaning in toward Bianca with a proprietary hand on the back of her chair. Enzo saw her shoulders hike up, a micro-flinch that screamed of months of terror. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was still the girl who saw the man behind the boss, but he had become a man who couldn't even see the suffering of his own sister. The transaction of loyalty was over. From this moment on, Enzo Killian wasn't just doing business. He was going to war for the only person who truly knew him. Enzo didn't confront Liam. Not yet. In the Killian organization, a direct accusation without a mountain of evidence was a spark in a powder keg, and Enzo needed a controlled burn. He maintained his stony facade during their morning briefing, watching Liam's mouth move as he detailed shipment schedules, all while Enzo's mind replayed the way Bianca had flinched at the dinner table. To the world, Enzo was the eye of the storm, but internally, something old, patient, and very cold had locked into place. He knew his own security detail was compromised. If Liam was the abuser, the men guarding the estate were either blind or bought. Enzo bypassed his usual channels and reached out to ghosts, investigators like Sullivan who operated in the digital and physical shadows where official records didn't exist. He gave Sullivan one name and a single directive: bottom of the ocean. While Enzo sat in his library pretending to review ledgers, the ghosts began to haunt Liam Valli's life. They didn't follow him in black SUVs. They watched through hijacked traffic cams and tracked the digital pings of a burner phone Liam thought was untraceable. Within 48 hours, the file arrived. The data revealed a pattern of errands that didn't align with family business. Every Tuesday and Thursday, while Enzo was at the docks, Liam's car disappeared into a crumbling district in the East Ward for exactly 2 hours. Sullivan had traced him to a third-floor walk-up, a blind apartment registered to a shell company Enzo had never authorized. Enzo drove there himself at midnight, leaving his guards behind. The building smelled of damp concrete and neglect, a sharp contrast to the silk and marble of the Killian estate. He picked the lock with a steady hand. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint, lingering scent of Bianca's perfume and the sharp, antiseptic smell of a first aid kit. He moved through the dark rooms with a flashlight. It wasn't a home. It was a cage. He found a bedroom with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. On the nightstand sat a cracked prepaid phone and a stack of cash hidden in a place no man would look. The exact survival tactics of someone who had learned that being noticed was never safe. Enzo stood in the center of the room, the silence of the apartment pressing against him like a physical weight. He realized then that while he had been playing the role of the untouchable boss, his own right hand had been building a private hell for his sister. The transactional loyalty he valued was a lie. He had been shaking the hand of a monster every morning. He closed the door softly, his face showing nothing, but the war had already begun. The silence of the Killian estate had always been a tool for Enzo's authority, but now it felt like a burial shroud. He found Maria, a housekeeper who had served his mother before him, trembling in the shadows of the linen room. She didn't look up when he entered. She simply gripped a stack of white towels until her knuckles matched the fabric. Enzo didn't loom over her. He stood by the window, watching the October wind batter the hedges, his presence a cold, patient weight in the small space. "I fired Mrs. Poole because she was a bully," Enzo said, his voice a low, even vibration that made the air in the room feel thin. "But she was a loud one. The quiet ones are the ones I worry about now, Maria." The woman's shoulders hitched, a jagged, broken movement. When she finally turned, her eyes were wet with a terror that reached back months. She spoke in a whisper, her words spilling out like a confession she could no longer hold. She told him about the nights she had stood outside Bianca's door, paralyzed as she heard the muffled, desperate cries of a sister who had no one to call for. "I wanted to come to you, Mr. Killian," Maria sobbed, her hands shaking so violently she had to press them against her chest. "I tried, but Mr. Valley, Liam, he found me in the kitchen one night. He didn't shout, he just showed me a photo of my grandson at his primary school. He told me that if I ever breathed a word to you, the boy wouldn't make it to the bus stop the next morning." Enzo's hands remained perfectly still on the back of a wooden chair, but inside, the transactional world he had built was burning to ash. He had paid Liam to be a shield, and instead, Liam had used that shield to crush the people Enzo was supposed to protect. Maria's voice broke as she described how Liam would follow Bianca into the rooms where the cameras didn't reach, his smile never wavering, even as he left marks that silk sleeves were meant to hide. "He said you wouldn't believe a maid over your own brother," Maria whispered, her eyes searching Enzo's face for a sign of the man she used to know. Enzo didn't blink. The betrayal was a stone in his chest, heavy and immovable. He realized now that his silence hadn't been peace, it had been an invitation for a monster. "You're done with the laundry for today, Maria," Enzo said, his voice dropping into that quiet certainty that signaled a change in the very air of the house. "Go to the guest wing. Stay with Bianca. From this moment on, no one enters that room unless they go through me." As he walked out, the house felt different. The silence no longer pressed against him. It was waiting for him to break it. The atmosphere in the Killian estate had shifted from a fortress of luxury into a house of whispers. Enzo stood by the tall windows of his private suite, watching the rain streak against the glass like tears. He had spent his life treating loyalty as a transaction, a simple exchange of currency for silence, but the sight of the purple handprints on Bianca's skin had shattered that cold logic. He realized now that providing guards and a gold-plated life had been a hollow victory, while the wolf he trusted most was already inside the gate. When the door finally opened, Bianca stepped in, her movements heavy and cautious as she clutched her pregnant belly. She looked at the sprawling, wood-paneled room, the most secure wing of the house, with a mixture of confusion and a deep-seated fear that she couldn't quite hide. "I don't understand, Enzo," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fireplace. "The doctor said I'm fine. Why am I being moved?" Enzo didn't turn around immediately. He needed his face to be a mask of professional detachment, the same calculated coldness he used in boardrooms and back alleys. "There have been complications in your blood work, Bianca," he lied, the words tasting like ash. "Stress-induced hypertension. The doctor wants you under constant observation, and this is the only wing with the necessary security and medical equipment." He turned then, seeing the way her eyes darted toward the door. She was checking the exits, a habit of the haunted that he recognized all too well. "You're safe here," he added, his voice dropping an octave. "No one enters this floor without my thumbprint, not even the senior staff, especially not Liam." At the mention of the name, Bianca's breath hitched, a jagged, broken sound. She didn't argue. The exhaustion in her shoulders seemed to pull her downward, the weight of months of silence finally beginning to buckle her knees. Outside in the hallway, the heavy thud of boots announced Liam's arrival. The door didn't open, but Enzo could see the shadow of his underboss through the frosted glass. The man who had been his right hand, now a silhouette of betrayal. "Boss, I have the security rotas for the week," Liam's voice called out, smooth and calm, carrying that same sinister undertone Enzo had only just learned to hear. "Leave them with the guard, Liam," Enzo replied, his hand tightening into a white-knuckled fist at his side. "And inform the men that the second floor is now a restricted zone. No exceptions. My sister needs absolute silence." There was a long, suffocating pause. Enzo could almost feel Liam's predatory smile through the wood, the frustration of a hunter losing his grip on his prey. Finally, the shadow moved away. Inside the room, Bianca let out a long, ragged exhale and sank into the velvet armchair. For the first time in years, the silence of the house didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a shield. The tension in the Killian estate had become a physical weight, thick enough to choke the air out of the room. Enzo sat behind his mahogany desk, his face a mask of stone, while Liam Valley paced the floor with a restless, predatory energy. For weeks, Enzo had been systematically severing Liam's ties to the organization, rerouting shipments, reassigning loyal soldiers, and moving Bianca into the fortified heart of the mansion, where Liam could no longer reach her. Liam stopped pacing, his eyes darting to the closed door before landing on Enzo. He let out a sharp, hollow laugh that sounded more like a rattle. "You've changed, Enzo," Liam said, his voice dropping into a tone of forced concern. "Ever since Bianca came back, you've been seeing ghosts. You're tearing apart the best crew we've ever had because of the delusions of a woman who hasn't been right in the head for years." Enzo didn't blink. He watched the way Liam's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the frantic need to regain control. "She isn't delusional, Liam. She's terrified," Enzo replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Exactly!" Liam snapped, leaning over the desk, his face inches from Enzo's. "She's terrified of shadows. Do you really think a woman in her condition with her history is a reliable witness? She's been through trauma we can't even imagine, Enzo. She's confused. She's projecting her past onto the people who are actually trying to save her." Liam took a breath, softening his expression into the mask of the loyal brother-in-arms Enzo had trusted for a decade. "I've seen her talking to herself in the gardens. I've seen her flinch at nothing. She's unwell, Enzo. She's manipulated you into thinking I'm the enemy because she needs someone to blame for her own instability. If you keep listening to her, you're going to lose everything we built for a lie born in a broken mind." The silence that followed was deafening. Enzo looked at the man across from him, the man who had shared his bread and guarded his back, and saw the wolf in sheep's clothing finally baring its teeth. Liam wasn't just defending himself, he was trying to rewrite Bianca's reality to save his own skin. It was a desperate psychological execution. "You're right about one thing, Liam," Enzo said, standing up slowly, his shadow looming large over the desk. "She has been through trauma, but the shadows she's afraid of have a name." He stepped around the desk, the air pressure in the room shifting as he closed the distance. "And I've realized that the only person seeing ghosts in this house is the man who thinks I'm still blind." Liam's confident smirk faltered, the first crack appearing in his armor as he realized that his gaslighting had not only failed, it had provided Enzo with the final proof of his malice. The walls weren't just closing in, they were about to collapse. The sterile scent of the private hospital wing offered no comfort to Enzo as he paced the length of the waiting room. It was 3 a.m., and the silence of the corridor was broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of life support monitors and the muffled, agonizing cries of Bianca from behind the heavy oak doors. She was 3 weeks early, her body finally buckling under the corrosive weight of the fear she had carried like a physical burden. Every time her blood pressure spiked, the monitors wailed, a shrill reminder of the stakes. Enzo stood by the window, his reflection in the glass looking like a man he didn't recognize, hollowed out and desperate. He had built a world where he was the apex predator, Yet he felt entirely powerless against the biological clock ticking inside his sister. He had delegated her safety to Liam Valley for years, a transactional error that had almost cost Bianca everything. Now, as he watched the nurses move with practiced urgency, he realized that his empire was a hollow shell if it couldn't protect the only blood he had left. A sudden movement at the end of the restricted hallway caught his eye. A man in a delivery uniform was arguing with the security detail at the nurses' station. Enzo's internal alarm, honed by years of back-office wars and street-level precision, went off instantly. The man's gait was too heavy, his posture too rigid. As the figure turned his head, the fluorescent lights caught a familiar, predatory tilt of the chin. It was Liam. Despite the arrest warrants and the tightening net, Liam's entitlement had morphed into a suicidal brand of obsession. He wasn't there to hide. He was there to reclaim the asset he believed was his. Enzo didn't reach for a weapon. He stepped into the hallway, his presence expanding to fill the narrow space, his eyes turning to the cold, patient stone that had made him the most feared name in 3 boroughs. Liam stopped 10 feet away, a twisted, confident smirk playing on his lips, the look of a man who still believed he was untouchable. "She's my wife, Enzo. You can't keep me from my child," Liam's voice echoed, thin and clinical against the backdrop of Bianca's labor pains. "You aren't family, Liam," Enzo said, his voice a low, steady murmur that carried the weight of a death warrant. "You're just a ghost I haven't finished burying yet." As security closed in, Enzo turned his back on the traitor, walking toward the room where a new life was struggling to begin, finally understanding that true loyalty wasn't about the absence of fear, but the presence of protection. The air in the subterranean council chamber was thick with the scent of old mahogany and the cold, metallic tang of unspent violence. Enzo Killian sat at the head of the table, his silhouette framed by the high-back leather chair, his expression an impenetrable mask of granite. Across from him, the 6 capos of the Killian organization sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between the boss and the empty chair to his right, the seat that had belonged to Liam Valley for a decade. When the heavy oak doors creaked open, Liam walked in with his usual practiced swagger, a confident, sinister smile playing on his lips as he made eye contact with the room. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke suit, oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere wasn't just heavy, it was terminal. "Sorry I'm late, Enzo," Liam said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was just checking in on Bianca. The doctor says she needs absolute quiet." Enzo didn't blink. He didn't shout. He simply leaned forward, his veins visible and his eyes wide with a quiet, terrifying intensity. "Sit down, Liam," Enzo commanded, the words dropping like lead weights. As Liam took his seat, Enzo reached out and pressed a button on the digital console embedded in the table. The room was suddenly filled not with the business of the streets, but with the sound of a woman sobbing. It was Bianca's voice, thin, ragged, and shattered. Then came Liam's voice, stripped of its charm, replaced by a low, guttural snarl that made the capos stiffen in their seats. "You think he'll choose you? You're just a liability now, Bianca. If you tell him, I'll make sure neither you nor that brat ever leave this house." The recording played the distinct, sickening sound of a hand striking flesh, followed by Bianca's sharp intake of breath, the very moment the finger-shaped bruises were burned into her skin. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. Liam's face drained of color, his predatory smile vanishing as he realized the wolf had been brought into the light. Enzo stood up slowly, his shadow stretching across the table until it swallowed Liam whole. "I treated loyalty as a transaction," Enzo said, his voice a low vibration of pure rage. "I thought as long as I paid you and gave you power, my family was safe." He looked at his capos, then back to the man he had once called a brother. "But you didn't just break a contract, Liam. You laid hands on my blood while she carried the future of this house." With a single nod, Enzo stripped Liam of his rank, his protection, and his name. The family court had reached its verdict before the strike even began. Liam was no longer a brother. He was a target. The sterile scent of the hospital's private wing was a sharp contrast to the heavy mahogany-scented air of the Killian estate. But for Enzo, it was the first place he had breathed clearly in months. The chaos of the night, the sirens, the frantic calls to Dr. Owe, and the shadow of Liam Valley finally being purged from their lives had settled into a profound, ringing silence. Bianca lay in the center of the room, her face pale and damp with sweat, but the jagged terror that had defined her expression for 2 years had vanished. In its place was a fragile, exhausted peace as she watched the small bundle in the transparent bassinet. "He's here, Enzo," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "He's safe." Enzo stepped forward, his heavy boots silent on the linoleum. He had spent his entire life building walls, treating loyalty as a transaction and people as pieces on a board. He had thought that by providing guards and gold, he had done his duty, failing to realize that the wolf was already inside the fold. Now, looking at his sister, he saw the cost of his coldness. He had nearly lost the only person who remembered the boy he used to be before the Empire demanded he become a monster. At the nurse's nod, Enzo reached into the bassinet. His hands, which had signed death warrants and gripped the lapels of trembling men, felt leaden and clumsy as he tucked his arms into a cradle. The infant was impossibly small, a 5-pound miracle wrapped in a white hospital blanket. As Enzo shifted the weight, a tiny, wandering hand escaped the swaddle and brushed against his thumb. The contact was electric. In that moment, the architecture of Enzo's world shifted. The warehouses, the territories, and the relentless pursuit of more suddenly felt like hollow clutter. For years he had believed that being feared was the ultimate protection. But as he looked down at his nephew's scrunched, determined face, he realized that fear was lonely and finite. This child was the new heir, not to a criminal syndicate or a legacy of violence, but to a future Enzo had never dared to imagine. The empire he had built through greed and grit finally had a heartbeat. It was no longer a cage to keep the world out. It was a shield to keep this child safe. He looked at Bianca and nodded, a silent promise passing between them that the cycle of fear ended here. As the morning sun turned the city skyline gold through the window, Enzo Killian sat in the vinyl chair and held the boy tight, realizing that for the first time in his life, the silence of the room didn't feel like emptiness. Enzo Killian learned that the greatest threat isn't the rival you see coming, but the brother who hides a knife behind a smile. He traded his cold heart for the safety of a child, proving that even a monster can become a guardian when family is on the line. If this story of justice and brotherhood hit home, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Share this with anyone who believes no one is above the law of family. Comment justice below if you want to see Liam get what he deserves, and turn on post notifications so you're the first to see our next cinematic journey.